Okay, let's unpack this. It's quite a situation. Imagine federal funds, for disaster preparedness, crucial stuff being tied to where a state stands on international trade. Sounds complex, right? Almost like something from a movie. But that's what we're diving into today. Our focus for this deep dive is this recent announcement from the Trump administration. It's about federal aid for natural disaster preparedness and the twist. It's linked to whether states and cities boycott Israeli companies. We're looking at reports from around August 4th, 5th, 2025, HuffPost, Newsweek, South China Morning Post. Our mission here is to pull out the key facts, the things you really need to know, the policy itself, the money involved, the different viewpoints, and importantly, some really surprising updates that came out almost immediately. What are the essentials to get you up to speed fast? So to start, let's pin down the policy itself. What exactly was announced and who announced it? Well, the core message was the Trump administration stated U.S. states and cities boycotting Israeli companies. They'd be denied federal aid for natural disaster preparedness. So it's tying routine federal money to a political stance.
Right. And FEMA, the Federal Emergency Management Agency, they put out grant notices. This was reported around August 4th. These notices mentioned terms and conditions. And those conditions basically required states to promise they wouldn't cut off commercial relations specifically with Israeli companies if they wanted the funding.
And the money involved, it's not trivial, is it?
No, not at all. We're talking about at least $1.9 billion that states count on. And this money covers, really essential things: search and rescue gear, salaries for emergency managers, backup power systems. Reuters reviewed, I think, 11 grant notices that detail these kinds of expenses.
So definitely tangible impacts, not just symbolic. Does this sort of thing, tying aid to a specific stance like this, have much precedent? Or is this a fairly new way to maybe exert federal influence?
Well, federal aid often has strings attached, that's true. Think highway funds linked to drinking age laws, things like that. But usually those strings are, let's say, more directly related to how the money is used. Here, linking critical disaster aid to a state's foreign policy stance, that feels different. It could be seen as using financial leverage pretty assertively to push a national foreign policy view down to the local level.
Potentially stepping on state autonomy.
Potentially, yeah. Yeah. And it fits a pattern we've seen noted. It's described as the administration's latest effort to use federal funding to promote its views on Israel. And it's not happening in a vacuum. DHS, the Department of Homeland Security, which oversees FEMA, they already said back in April that boycotting Israel was prohibited for states and cities getting its grants.
Okay, so there was prior indication.
Exactly. And there's another example, too. FEMA apparently said in July that states would need to use some federal terrorism prevention funds to help with arresting migrants, another instance of tying funds to other priorities. And just to put a finer point on the money, one grant notice ties agreement on the Israel policy to getting a share of $553.5 million. This is money set aside specifically for preventing terrorism in dense urban areas.
So big cities are directly affected.
Very much so. New York, for example, was said to get about $92.2 million from that program based on FEMA's own risk analysis. So yeah, the stakes are high for places like that.
Now here's where it gets really interesting. The specific target. This policy takes aim squarely at the boycott, divestment, and sanctions movement, right? BDS.
That's correct.
And just briefly, BDS is that global campaign pushing for economic pressure on Israel regarding the Palestinian territories. We saw its profile rise, its supporters get louder, particularly in 2023 after the Hamas attack and Israel's response in Gaza.
And the administration's official reason for this policy, they explicitly link it to anti-discrimination. A spokesperson for Homeland Security Secretary Kristi Noem said, and this is a direct quote, DHS will enforce all anti-discrimination laws and policies, including as it relates to the BDS movement, which is expressly grounded in anti-Semitism.
So they're directly calling the BDS movement anti-Semitic in their justification.
Yes. And another DHS statement added, those who engage in racial discrimination should not receive a single dollar of federal funding.
Oh.
That's quite a direct connection they're making there in the official rationale.
Okay, but then things took a very sharp turn. This is the really crucial development, reported on the same day as the initial news broke. Adds a whole layer of confusion, maybe.
It certainly does.
Newsweek updated their story on August 4th. They reported that when they and other outlets reached out for comment on that Monday, this was after the initial reports about the policy were already circulating. DHS, the Department of Homeland Security, denied that there was any current notice of funding opportunity, that's a no FO, the official grant announcement, or any FEMA requirement tied to Israel.
Denied it outright.
Yes. A DHS spokesperson is quoted saying, There is no FEMA requirement tied to Israel in any current NOFO. No states have lost funding, and no new conditions have been imposed.
Oh.
And they added that FEMA grants remain governed by existing law and policy and not political litmus tests.
Wow. Okay, that does create a bit of whiplash for anyone trying to follow this.
Hmm.
I mean, what does it mean when an agency says something that seems to flatly contradict earlier reports, maybe even its own posted documents like those grant notices?
Right. What happened there?
It really throws a spotlight on how fast things can change or seem to change. Was it a miscommunication? A policy walked back very quickly, maybe floated and then retracted?
Or maybe internal disagreement.
Could be. It just highlights how important it is to keep checking for updates, especially with government policy announcements. Don't just take the first headline.
That's a great point. It's tough, though, when official sources seem to contradict themselves within hours. How do you, as someone just trying to stay informed, critically evaluate that?
It is tough. I think the key is, like you said, noticing the contradiction. Don't just accept the latest statement as erasing the first. You have to ask why the first reports came out. Where did they originate? Those grant notices mentioned by Reuters, for example. Were they draft notices? Were they posted and then pulled? Understanding the sequence and the source of each piece of information helps build a fuller, if still maybe confusing picture. It tells you something is going on, even if it's not clear exactly what.
Absolutely. Okay, so bearing that clarification or contradiction in mind, let's look at the reactions to the initial reports of the policy before the DHS denial came out. And just a reminder, we're reporting these views impartially, not taking sides. So from the BDS movement, Mahmoud Nawaja called the reported FEMA requirement shameful. Pretty direct.
And on the other side, you had groups like the American Jewish Committee, the AJC. Their director of anti-Semitism policy, Holly Huffnagel, confirmed they supported the administration's policy as it was first reported.
But the really fascinating reaction perhaps came from within the president's own base.
Yes, that was striking. The reports say the administration drew the fury of some of the president's staunchest supporters. It apparently highlighted this broader fissure within the Republican Party.
Between who exactly?
Between the more traditional hawks who strongly back aid for Israel and the more isolationist Mangier figures who are wary of getting involved in Middle East conflicts.
And we saw specific examples.
Oh, yes. On X, formerly Twitter, Candace Owens wrote quite strongly, accusing Trump of betraying America for Netanyahu, even referencing a major Republican donor.
Straw words.
Very. Milo Yiannopoulos apparently wrote, this cannot be real. And the Hodgkins asked, is this America first? Questioning the alignment with that core slogan. And this wasn't the first time we saw this kind of pushback from that wing. Back in May, some prominent MAGA figures spoke out against a bipartisan bill, the IGO Anti-Boycott Act, House Resolution 8760.
What was that about?
It aimed to penalize participation in boycotts against Israel. Critics, including those MAGA figures, argued it was an attack on free speech. The backlash was strong enough that a planned vote was actually canceled.
Interesting context.
Representative Marjorie Taylor Greene was very vocal against that bill, too. She posted on X saying she'd vote NO, defending Americans' rights to boycott freely. She questioned voting on bills for other countries instead of focusing on domestic issues. And it's perhaps relevant that she recently became the first Republican in Congress to call Israel's actions in Gaza a genocide.
So definite friction there within the party on this issue.
And then you had groups like CARA, the Council on American Islamic Relations. Robert McCaw, from their government affairs arm, called the initial demand patently unconstitutional and un-American.
Strong language there, too.
Yes. He argued it was ludicrous that states could boycott any other country, even the U.S. itself, theoretically, but not Israel under this rule. He framed it as Israel first, not America first.
And he raised concerns about the practical impact.
He did. He pointed out that denying disaster aid based on this could literally cost lives after hurricanes or wildfires, calling it state-sanctioned cruelty that undermines democracy while supporting, in his words, genocide and apartheid abroad.
Just for balance, we should note Israel's position on those accusations.
Right. The sources note that Israel has vehemently denied carrying out a genocide in Gaza and blames Hamas for reported starvation in the territory.
So putting it all together, what does this all mean for you, the listener, beyond the headlines, beyond the confusing back and forth? What's the real impact, practical and symbolic?
Well, one point raised is that, practically speaking, the initial requirement might have been largely symbolic for many states.
How so?
Because, according to a University of Pennsylvania law journal, something like 34 states already have anti-BDS laws or policies on the books.
So for them, a federal rule wouldn't change much on the ground.
It would align with their existing state policies, essentially.
Yeah.
But looking at the bigger picture, there are a few key things to take away, I think. First, you really see this complex tangle of foreign policy, domestic funding, and fundamental rights like free speech
Yeah.
or the right to boycott, as critics frame it, international issues echoing right down into local emergency
Yeah,
budgets.
that connection is stark.
Second, it's a masterclass in just how fluid information can be in a 24/7 news cycle, especially with government announcements, the speed of the report, and then the denial. It really forces you to be a critical news consumer.
You can't just read one story and assume that's the end of it.
Exactly. Third, it pulls back the curtain on internal party politics. Seeing that split in the Republican base over this issue, the hawks versus the isolationists, is fascinating.
Shows that these coalitions aren't always monolithic.
Precisely. And maybe fourth, that rapid sequence announcement, then denial, tells us something about how policy might be made or unmade very quickly, perhaps reacting to immediate pushback. Or maybe it points to internal confusion. It's a puzzle.
So, to recap, we had this initially reported policy linking disaster aid to boycotts of Israel, involving potentially billions in funding. Then, a very swish clarification or denial from DHS on the same day, and reactions all over the map, including sharp criticism from within the president's own OGA base.
And maybe a final thought to leave you with, something to mull over. Think about how situations like this really shine a light on the web of financial dependencies between the federal government and state governments, and how those dependencies can become tools, or at least be perceived as tools, to push specific policy goals, even ones seemingly unrelated to the funding itself. What does that signal about the shifting balance of power between Washington, D.C. and the states? And what might it mean for the future if federal dollars get tied to more and more state-level stances?
Definitely a lot to chew on there. We hope walking through these different perspectives and the rapid developments helps you weigh these complex issues as you continue to follow the story.